Chag Sameach to all those who are joining us online. I hope you saw in the message on our chat that the cheesecake competition is well underway here and has taken a few more minutes. So we will be beginning our Tikkun Leil in just a few minutes. You can see what's happening here in the sanctuary a little bit. I'm going to turn the microphone off until we're ready to start, but Chag Sameach, and we'll be starting in just a few minutes. That's not on yet, but now it is.
Good evening, everyone, and to those watching on the live stream, welcome back. My name is Gary Roebuck, and I'm presently serving as interim rabbi of Temple Beth Israel, but for tonight only, I'd like you to call me by my nickname, Elchanan Yoel ben Eliezer v'Rachel. Say it after me. You know, it's funny because when you're the rabbi standing at the Amud at the reader's table and somebody gets called for a aliyah to the Torah, and I say, what's your Hebrew name? They say, and I say, what? It's not so easy. Tonight, we're very, very fortunate to have my good friend, Dr. Simon Holloway, the head of education of the Jewish Holocaust Museum or Center here in Melbourne. He has worked previously for 6 years as education officer at the Sydney Jewish Museum, where he lectured on Nazi racial science, Jewish resistance, and the history of the Holocaust. Simon also serves as a sessional academic at the University of Sydney, though most recently he and his family have relocated here to Melbourne. So we have two wonderful young families who've relocated to Melbourne. Aren't we the better for it, eh? Yay. He has received a doctorate in classical Hebrew and biblical studies, and in his free time he's a student of the Babylonian Talmud and an avid consumer of fantasy fiction. Oh, I don't know what you've learned from Talmud and Hebrew studies, but your fantasy fiction's drawn a lot of love. You know, there are a couple of concepts, valuable Jewish principles that progressive Jews treasure very much. One is Tikkun Olam, the repair, the mending of the world, as it's been put colloquially. And the other is pikuach nefesh, the saving of a life. Many who have limited knowledge of the halacha will nonetheless know pikuach nefesh dochet haShabbat, that the saving a life is so paramount that one is permitted, even obliged, to violate the Shabbat to save a life. But if things were only that simple, whose life? When? Under what circumstances? The subject is rich, and tonight Simon is here to probe that vein and to explore a value which is among our religion's most important. I'd like to invite you to welcome Simon to our Tikkun Leil as warmly as you can. Let's go.
Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you, everyone. Can everybody hear me, actually, if I'm speaking without the aid of a roaming microphone or anything like that? I hope that you folks at home can hear me clearly as well.
The microphone is on. This one is on. Yeah.
Very good. Having actually already dispersed the handout that I hope everybody has a copy of, or can at least see a copy of, I've noticed that a number of people are already having a little bit of a look over it, and will no doubt see that we're going to be getting into some fairly gritty material this evening. I wanted to really have a little bit of a look at the parameters of this phenomenon that we refer to as pikuach nefesh. Because as Rabbi Gary has just pointed out, it's one of those phrases that we hear very, very frequently, this idea of saving a life as a great virtue in and of itself. It's not a means to an end, it is an end. And in as much as it is an end, it is a noble end. It is in and of itself a mitzvah, but it is also a principle that underlies many other mitzvahs. We're going to see actual specific examples of this, the degree to which this necessity of saving a life, ensuring that a person might survive or that a person might live or maintain even quality of life, is something that's going to underscore a lot of other things that are stipulated within the biblical and rabbinic literature as well. And what I wanted this to be tonight, and as much as it's possible in this sort of scenario that we have this evening, I wanted this to be a little bit of a discussion. And I'm mic'd, but you're not. However, I would like you to please respond with opinions of your own, questions of your own throughout. What I'm going to take the liberty to do, if anybody does do so, is actually repeat your questions or repeat your responses, both for the benefit of those folks who are not with us this evening, as well as anybody here who might not be able to hear what somebody has called out. But I wanted to do that because The sources that we're going to be looking at this evening are by no means obvious. These are not cut and dry sources that very clearly mean one particular thing to the exclusion of all else. But there is a possibility for a range of interpretations on these issues. And I wanted to start off actually with the very first quote that is there at the top of the first page underneath the heading, which if anybody who doesn't have a copy of this in front of them, in fact with all of them, I'm going to read it out loud anyway. And it's a quote from the Bible, it's a quote from the Torah that says, Lo ta'amod al dam re'echa, which literally means, and I say literally, but actually all of these translations are my own, so feel free to dislike them. It means, in my translation, do not stand by the blood of your neighbor. Lo ta'amod al dam re'echa, do not stand by the blood of your neighbor. Now, some of you have already read on and seen what the Talmud does with this, but even without reading on, would anybody here like to suggest for me, what might that mean? Don't stand by the blood of your neighbor. Take action. Great, take action when? Okay, so don't stand by the blood of your neighbor when your neighbor is bleeding, when somebody is in distress. Obviously, it doesn't need to be literally your next door neighbor, but another person is in distress, they're in trouble, you must do something. And I think it's important the way that you phrase that, because I think in some ways that's sort of the more obvious way to say this. But the Torah doesn't say that. It doesn't say do something, it says don't stand by, almost like don't do nothing. Why that distinction, do you think? Why not say, do something? Why not say, save them? Leaves it to your discretion, okay?
Civil law,
Yeah?
stand by and watch, providing you don't move a fingernail. Once you're into the conspirator, then you must feel guilty of crime. And in this case, it leaves that discretion up to the
Okay, so it leaves the possibility for discretion on behalf of the person who is watching, that they not perhaps land themselves, as you have suggested, in the case of civil law, they might land themselves in some degree of strife if they start to do something but don't continue. So perhaps we have to bear in mind that the halakha, the Jewish law, is itself a legal system. Okay, there's a weight of literature behind all of these principles, and to be more precise, in front of all of these principles. So there's a long process, the long, slow process to bring this down to actual practical normative law today. Yeah?
It's not necessarily that you have to, but you need to make context of it.
Fabulous. So that you yourself might not do something, you yourself might not be able to do something. To choose just one particular example, I see somebody drowning in a river. Let's say, for the purposes of this example, I don't know how to swim. I'm under no obligation to leap into the river. Now, there's two people drowning in the river, but I have to do something. So perhaps by phrasing this in the negative, don't do nothing, it allows the possibility of you yourself might not physically go and assist them, but you might be able to assist them in some other way. So let's hold on to that particular thought. If you have a look at the next text here, this is from the Talmud, this is from Tractate Sanhedrin, and it says, from where do we learn? And I just want to interrupt this, actually, I'm going to interrupt myself. I do that from time to time. Whenever the Talmud says, from where do we learn? It means we already know this thing. Okay, there is a thing I'm about to tell you that everybody knows. Everybody knows because it's common sense or because it's obvious, but we want to have a source for this. Where do we get this idea from? Okay, so where do we learn that if one sees his friend drowning in a river, and of course it doesn't have to be literally one's friend, or an animal is dragging him, or robbers are approaching him, these are all different sorts of situations that in the world of the Talmud might have been considered relatively common, the one is obligated to save them, because the Torah says, don't stand by the blood of your neighbor. So we all know this idea, or we all should know this idea, that you are obligated to save another person that's in distress. Like I said, it's obvious or it's common sense, but we have to be wary of the commonsensical. We have to be wary of what seems obvious, because sometimes once we actually probe the contours of the halakha, we find it's anything but. But in this particular instance, we'll all be relieved to know that the law matches up to what our common sense might suppose. You see somebody in strife, in the Talmud's words, one's friend is in danger. How do we know that we need to do something from them? Because the Torah says, don't do nothing. And the point that you made a moment ago, that you don't necessarily need to save them yourself, is a very good one. And I'm only sharing with you one small passage here from the Talmud. But if you have a look actually at what the Rambam says, we're going to jump now ahead from the Talmud to the 12th century. The Rambam codifies this as law in his Mishneh Torah. And he says, and these are in his words, all who are able to save and who do not save, this is the third text, anybody who does not save but is able to do so transgresses this prohibition of not standing idly by the blood of your neighbor. Now, this applies whether one is able to save this person oneself or, exactly as you pointed out, whether one is able to hire others to do so. And he gives some examples. And with all of these instances, examples are always going to be drawn from the world of the person who's writing this text. We are all of us the product of a time and a place. The Rambam, obviously, in the 12th century is no exception. So he says, whether one hears of Gentiles or informers who are planning against the person, they're planning to do something bad to them, and you've heard of this, or they're laying a trap, and you don't reveal what you've heard, or you know of a Gentile or a coercer who is making plans against somebody, and you have the ability to beseech that person. You can do something to mollify them, but you don't do so. In all of these instances, you are to be considered guilty. Okay, that's hard and fast. Absolutely, that deserves a good a thump on the thigh. This is the law as far as the Rambam is concerned. The Torah prohibits doing nothing. And that doesn't mean that you are necessarily obligated to save that person, but you have to do something in order to save that person. In a nutshell, or you become an accomplice. Okay, so that itself is an interesting issue. So I appreciate, perhaps in civil law, you may hold a degree of responsibility. Remains to be seen whether or not in the halakha you might be considered an accomplice to that murder. I'm making this distinction only because halachically there are specific penalties for murder that are not necessarily meted out to a person who in this situation, let's say, didn't save another person. They might not be considered to be actually a murderer, but they do bear some measure of responsibility for this individual's death. So far, this is all fairly straightforward, I think. Nothing particularly controversial. We're going to get to some controversial in a moment, don't worry. But this, in a nutshell, really is this principle of pikuach nefesh. You have an obligation to save a person's life. This is much more complicated in our day and age, when it's possible to hear of a person who is in trouble, and this person who is in trouble, or these people who are in trouble, might actually be on the other side of the planet. Okay, they might be living somewhere where you would otherwise have no possibility of being aware of what is going on for them, and no earthly possibility of actually getting involved and assisting them in any way, that our ability to assist one another has grown commensurately greater since the 12th century. So there's a lot of different factors at play here, but the basic principle, I think, is a fairly straightforward one. You have an obligation to save somebody's life. Anything that you can do towards saving that person's life is therefore something that you must do. Or at the very least, you must not do nothing. You have to act in some response. I'm going to skip over the following text. I'm going to come back to it actually a little bit later, but I want to introduce another idea first because let's bring in a little bit of controversy. We need a little bit of a difficulty here, and I want to introduce this idea that concerns the degree to which a person is responsible to save their own life. Now, that might sound a little bit strange, because if you're obligated to save another person's life, well, obviously, you should be obligated to save your own. That should really be a little bit of a no-brainer. So let me phrase this question another way. How far is a person allowed to go in order to save their own life? Similarly, and it might sound very similarly, but as we'll see, there are some distinctions. How far is a person obligated to go in order to save their life? So I'm just going to leave those two questions just sort of floating there for the moment in the sort of the ether above our heads. How far is a person allowed to go to save their own life, and how far are they obligated to go in order to save their own life? And I'm going to share a verse with you, but we're not going to say anything about this verse just yet. I just want to introduce you to this verse. It's the next verse that is included here, that says, "Ushemartem et chukotai ve'et mishpatai, asher ya'aseh otam ha'adam v'chai bahem. Which I have translated, this is from Leviticus chapter 18, you should observe my statutes and my laws, that one may do and live through them. Okay? Like the previous verse, this one also ends with, I am the Lord. But the important part is the part before that you should observe my statutes and my laws, that a person would do and live through them, right? Through which they would live. Taken at face value, I suppose, a fairly straightforward injunction to observe all of the laws of the Torah. There's many passages within the Torah like this, similar to this in structure, certainly is similar to it in intent. We'll come back to this verse in a moment. I just want to introduce you to the verse. Rabbi Gary, a moment ago, in his very warm introduction before I came up onto the stage, mentioned this phrase, Pikuach nefesh docher haShabbat, that saving a life trumps Shabbos. Okay, it takes precedence over the observation of Shabbat. That's another one of those things that, as far as the Talmud was concerned, everybody knows, or at least everybody should know. Okay, they don't ask. At no point do they ask whether or not you should break Shabbos in order to save a life. They ask, from where do we learn that you should do this thing? Okay, similar to the last text. From where do we learn that saving a life takes precedence over Shabbat? And to give you, by the way, a very kind of Talmudic example, if a person is sick, and in the world of the Talmud, that doesn't necessarily have to mean chronic illness, could even mean a woman is pregnant. Okay, they considered a woman's being pregnant to be a case of sakanat nefashot, okay, sakanat nefesh, that it's a life-endangering situation. And she's hungry. She wants to eat food. She says, I need to eat something now. And it's Shabbos and you have no food in the house. And you can't say, well, look, Shabbos is going to be out in about 5.5 hours. If you could just hold on a little bit, I'll get you something to eat. Okay, so the Talmud assumes that we all know that. I feel like we do all know that, but sometimes it's comforting to know that the Talmud also assumes that we all know that that is unexamined, that's simply the way that it is. So that if you, again, to just go with a Talmudic example, if you have chickens in the backyard, you can go out into the backyard, you can shecht a chicken, you can slaughter a chicken, you can pluck the chicken, you can salt the chicken to get out all of the blood, you can light a fire, and you can cook a chicken. Okay, there's the 5 different things that under normal circumstances you cannot do on a Shabbos. Normally on a Shabbos you can't slaughter an animal, you can't pluck the feathers of the animal, you can't salt the animal, you can't light a fire, and you can't cook the animal. But these are 5 things, not that you are allowed to do in order to feed this person, they're 5 things you have to do. If you don't do those things, you're guilty. Okay, this is that principle again of sort of a pikuach nefesh. But we see here, it clearly takes precedence over Shabbat. So all that the Talmud wants to know is, all right, great. It's obvious, we get it, but how do we know that? What's a scriptural source for that? What's something in the Torah that justifies this idea? So in this passage that I'm going to share with you, which just goes a little bit over the page, it's from Tractate Yoma in the Babylonian Talmud. The story is told of 3 rabbis who are traveling down the road, and someone comes up to them randomly, and this is the question that person asks them. Okay, we all appreciate being asked a random question in the middle of the street. This is that random question that these 3 rabbis got asked. How do we know that saving a life takes precedence over Shabbos? In my translation of this passage, I've cut out the first 2 responses. Okay, only because they're just a little bit more involved, and I didn't want us to get too sidetracked with the precise kind of ins and outs. But we'll go straight to the 3rd one, which is Rabbi Elazar, who spoke up and he said, inasmuch as circumcision, which pertains to but one of the 248 parts of a person's body, takes precedence over Shabbat, all the more so should the entire body take precedence over Shabbat. So let's back up for a moment. I might actually put this to the room. Anyone can explain the logic here. Inasmuch as circumcision, which applies to but one of the 248 parts of the body, takes precedence over Shabbat, all the more so should saving a life, which pertains to everything, take precedence over Shabbat. In what way, can someone tell me, in what way do we say that circumcision takes precedence over Shabbat? What does that mean? There's no logic to it at all? It's a bit harsh, but okay. It's a mitzvah, yeah. Okay, so entering the covenant, maintaining the covenant, the Brit, we often we refer to a circumcision as a Brit. Brit literally means a covenant. To enter the covenant is more important than Shabbat. There's another reason as well, by the way, that a circumcision might take precedence over Shabbat, and it's not necessarily philosophical, but you may be right, yes?
It's the 8th day, it has to be on the 8th
Ah.
day. If it happens to fall on Shabbos, it's still going to tax precedence.
We have a positive mitzvah, an obligation in the Torah, that a little boy has to be circumcised on the 8th day after he is born. The way we count that, by the way, is you start with the day on which he's born. So if he's born on a Shabbos, okay, so that's the Shabbos, there's the first day, and then it's Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and the Shabbos is the 8th day. So if he's born on the Shabbos, the 8th day is a Shabbos, and because there is a positive mitzvah for him to be circumcised on the 8th day, that means it has to be on the Shabbos. That's, by the way, that's only if it's the 8th day. If he's born, let's say, on a Wednesday, but he's not well, and they need to delay the bris, they need to delay the circumcision, and they can't do it on the Wednesday, they can't do it on the Thursday, they can't do it on the Friday. The first available day to do it is the Shabbos. It doesn't take precedence over Shabbos. It doesn't take precedence because it involves a forbidden act. It involves something that normally you cannot do on Shabbos, which is to cut off a part of the body. You can't do that on Shabbat. Okay, it's a non-emergent medical procedure. Okay, cannot be performed on a Shabbos. So it will be pushed off to the Sunday. If the Sunday is a Yontif, it can't be done on a Yontif either. It gets pushed off again. But if it's on the 8th day, and the 8th day is either a Shabbos or it's a Yontif, it takes precedence. So he's trying to employ kind of a logical argument here. The name for this type of argument in the Talmud is a kal v'chomer. Kal v'chomer means a light and a heavy. Here's a light case, which is circumcision. It's a light case because it only pertains to 1/248th of the body. Okay, 1 fraction of the body. How much more so should this apply then in a strong case that applies to the whole body? Let's not get too caught up in this business of 248, by the way. They're not going to, they didn't necessarily count the individual parts of a body, but they took it on faith. They understood that there were 248 parts of a little boy's body. How this necessarily worked with little girls is a whole other topic. 248 parts of the body, and they use that as a mnemonic because there are 248 positive commandments in the Torah, one for each part of the body. And the mitzvah of circumcision, which pertains to only one part of the body, takes precedence over Shabbat. Therefore, says Rabbi Elazar, how much more so should saving an entire body take precedence over Shabbat? That's his justification. Okay, remember, we just want to know, how do we know this idea that saving a life takes precedence over Shabbat? Apropos of this conversation between these three different rabbis, the Talmud now starts to quote a bunch of other rabbis from earlier generations who had also answered the same question, who had also said how we know that saving a life takes precedence over Shabbat. So if you have a look down in the third line, we've got Rabbi Yossi ben Rabbi Yehuda, who quotes the Torah as saying, Et shabtotai tishmoru. The actual full quote is Ach et shabtotai tishmoru, which means, but you should observe my Shabbats. So he argues one thinks that this must apply to all situations, but the Torah says, but you must observe my Shabbats, and but creates a distinction. There must be situations in which you don't observe Shabbat, and this is that. These aren't necessarily strong arguments. I'm not expecting anybody here is necessarily like, oh, that's a zinger, I'm convinced. There's just different rabbis trying to explain where does the Torah, which never explicitly says that saving a life takes precedence over Shabbat, where does it ever say anything from which we could theoretically derive that idea? So they're kind of reaching a little bit, because the Torah really doesn't say that. It really is something that they just know. They know it kind of logically. Rabbi Yonatan ben Yosef quotes another verse in the Torah, Ki kodesh hi lachem, that it, being Shabbat, is holy to you. Because it says kodesh hi lachem, it is holy to you, that is to say that Shabbat is given over to you, but you are not given over to Shabbat. So you don't have to die for the sake of Shabbat's being observed. Rabbi Shimon ben Manasseh says something a little bit similar, V'shamru b'nei Yisrael et ha-Shabbat. We quote this every Shabbos afternoon in the Kiddush, that the children of Israel kept Shabbat. And the Torah is suggesting, he says, you should break one Shabbat so that you can observe lots of Shabbats. Okay, that if you're in a situation where the only way for you to survive is by breaking Shabbat, By breaking Shabbat, you will come to observe lots of other Shabbats. Okay, here's the clincher. Here at the very, very end. So it's at the very bottom of the page. We've got a quote from Shmuel. Rav Yehuda quotes Shmuel saying, I'm not convinced with any of this stuff. Okay, none of these arguments really holds water. If I were there, I would have given him an answer that would just blow them out of the water. Okay, I've got the real answer. This is really where the Torah says it. And it's the verse that I quoted for you before. Okay, that in full said, you should observe my statutes and my commandments, that a person would do and live through them, v'chai bahem, and live through them, not die through them. So it's not just that saving a life takes precedence over Shabbat. Saving a life takes precedence over everything. All of the commandments of the Torah are superseded by the obligation to save a life. Based on this idea that the commandments of the Torah are things that you do, that you might live through them. And Rava says, Rava's of a little bit of a later generation, when he gets told about this, he says, all of their explanations, all of these other explanations that we've just seen, yeah, they're not bad, but they could all be rebutted. But this one, Shmuel's, has no rebuttal. And in subsequent literature, that's taken as the answer. That's taken as how we know, not just when it comes to Shabbat, but how we know when it comes to all mitzvahs in the Torah, that saving a life takes precedence over those mitzvahs. We know it because the Torah describes mitzvahs as things that you should do and live through them. All right. In a moment, I'm going to tell you that what I just said isn't entirely true. But before we get to that, does anybody have any observations about what we've just seen or any questions about what we've just looked at here? Yes, please. Oh, that's a lovely observation. So both of those verses that we just looked at before, the one from Leviticus, actually they're both from Leviticus chapter 19, chapter 18, they both end with this phrase, I am the Lord. There's a bunch of verses within the Torah that do end in that phrase. And the Talmud does all sorts of different things with that, but one of the things that it often does, and it does it actually when it comes to these two laws as well, is this idea that there are some principles that nobody will know if you don't keep. It's really between you and God. So to go with that first example, don't stand idly by the blood of your neighbor. No one's going to know whether or not you really tried to help. Okay, that's you know, okay? The reality is God knows. So it's a bit of a reminder in that instance that God is aware of those things. So we get those sorts of stipulations sometimes in passages that have to do with defrauding people, having dishonest weights and measurements and so forth, or the idea that you should not hate another person in your heart. Well, you can't police that. Okay, that's not one of the mitzvahs that can actually be enforced in any respect, but you get this sort of stipulation that I am the Lord. And there's that sort of reminder perhaps. So that's one of the ways that the Talmud sort of interprets that line. But that's well observed that both of those passages end with that stipulation too. All right, before we get into some gritty stuff, and it does get a little bit gritty. I like gritty. Yeah.
How immediate or intense does the threat need to be before you are obliged to take action?
Great question. So how immediate or intense does a threat need to be before you're obliged to take action? Look, that's something that in later halachic literature, so post-Talmud, people do comment on. So I can't tell you that there is a sort of a hard and fast ruling in this regard because, there oftentimes isn't. But one of the ways that people do often understand this is it needs to be a sort of a clear and present danger, that it's not abstract, okay? That you can't do something because potentially what you are doing may come down the line to save a person's life, that itself wouldn't necessarily supersede Shabbat or various other mitzvot and so forth, that it needs to be an actual immediate danger. But people will have different interpretations as regards really what that means and how does that kind of play out in reality. But just as a general rule of thumb, we consider even something that is doubtfully life-threatening to be life-threatening. And when I say we, I don't mean me and my buddies or, all of us in this room, but generally speaking, rabbis throughout history have considered a possibility of its being a life-threatening issue to mean that it's a life-threatening issue. So there are certain groups of people who are considered to be particularly at risk. So people who are very elderly, people who have chronic illness, people who are very, very young, so small children, for example, people who are pregnant, as with the example that I gave before. So these are all instances in which we consider even a slim possibility of it's being life-threatening, it's a life-threatening issue. When it comes to other people, we might argue that there's greater latitude to sort of to determine in the moment. But if there is a sense that this is really potentially a life-threatening issue, you've got to do something about it.
It reminds me of the line with the lesson that comes from it, am I my brother's keeper?
Okay. Yeah, very nice. Because, when Cain says that line, obviously it's a little bit rhetorical because we as the audience know he is, actually. He does have responsibility to his brother.
And he's just faithful.
And he has himself just spilled blood. Yeah, right. So it's an interesting line because it's sort of, he says it as a rhetorical line, but the answer is, well, you were actually your brother's keeper. You were obligated to look after him. Yeah. I can't comment on that, but I will say that, and just in general in relation to Israel, Israel is not a country that is run in accordance with the halakha. So there are in Israeli hospitals, as there are in Australian hospitals, there are boards of ethicists who will weigh in on ethical issues. I can't comment on the degree to which those decisions in Israeli hospitals might be informed by religious considerations, and that even where they are informed by religious considerations, where it's informed strictly speaking by the halakha. But that's an interesting observation in as much as they were working around the clock to develop a vaccines. Yeah.
Does the idea of pikuach nefesh apply to contemporary situations as well?
Very much so, yes.
Where would it sit in relation to assisted dying, for instance?
Now that's clearly a very easy topic for us to address in a small amount of time. So there's no easy way for me to address that, and it doesn't. It's a complicated one, and look, when we talk about pikuach nefesh, let's be mindful that to bear in mind we are talking about prolonging life. So the business of terminating life in order to allow for the patient's greater comfort. There is a vast body of halachic literature about this as well, but I don't believe it would come under the rubric of pikuach nefesh. That it's a separate rubric. Yeah.
One of these quotes here, people use this to justify the killing of Yitzhak Rabin.
Yes, thank you very much. I was intending to, as a matter of fact. That was the passage that I skipped over because I wanted to come back to it in a moment. Let's have that moment first, and then I'm going to come to that passage because that was back in 1994. Was it 94, 95? That was the first time I ever encountered that law. People were talking about it at the time after the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin. So before I come to that, actually, and thank you for pointing that out, let's have a look at this next text. I mentioned a moment ago that I'm going to show you a text that demonstrates that what I just said isn't entirely true. And that's this one here. It's from Tractate Sanhedrin. We're told that Rabbi Yochanan said the following in the name of Rabbi Shimon ben Yehotzedek, and I've had the tremendous privilege of being able to teach this course here on Thursday evenings for the last 5 or so weeks. I know there's a few people here tonight who have been in that course, and those of you who were will have seen this very recently. Some of the rest of you may have seen this in the past as well. But here's the statement that Rabbi Yochanan said. He says that they took a vote in the attic of Beit Nitzeh in Lod, and they came to a conclusion. Okay, the rabbis actually sat down. Sometimes this is how they did things. They came to a vote, and they decided, concerning all mitzvahs in the Torah, if you were to tell somebody to transgress that mitzvah or be killed, they should transgress it and not be killed. Seems fairly straightforward. This is in line with what we just saw. Save for 3. There are 3 mitzvahs, there are 3 aveiros, I should say. There are 3 transgressions that you cannot do, even at the cost of your life. They are idolatry, sexual immorality, and murder. Now, sexual immorality is a bit of a vague term. The Hebrew is gilui arayot, and I've chosen to translate it here as sexual immorality. Literally means uncovering of nakedness. It's a phrase that turns up in the Bible in places like Leviticus chapter 18, chapter 20, where you get long lists of incest prohibitions, for example, and the prohibition of adultery. Murder is fairly straightforward. Actually, you know what? None of these are straightforward. All of these generate a lot of discussion regarding different circumstances and what might actually constitute a murder or what might constitute idolatry and so forth. But in a general sense, these three transgressions you cannot do even to save your life. Okay, that's a big claim. And I'm going to make another big claim. I'm going to tell you that in the history of rabbinic jurisprudence, no one's ever disagreed with that. They might have modified it. They might have said, look, you know, what constitutes idolatry in this situation, or what constitutes murder, or how do we classify sexual immorality? But as a general principle, this idea that you have these three big transgressions that even to save your life you cannot commit is something that is not disputed. Okay. I would love. I can tell you. I can't comment on that, and so I won't. But I will say that when it comes to idolatry, there's a long-standing discussion as to what constitutes idolatry, and it's not necessarily clear. So what I will say is, in a modern-day context, and not even in a modern-day context, if we look for historical precedents of a person's, let's say, being forcibly converted to another religion by the sword, there is a long-standing history of viewing certain major religions as not idolatry. There's a very famous example of this, actually. Lubavitchers today, just because you give me the example of Chabad friends of yours, are very keen on the Rambam. Everybody's very keen on the Rambam. But the Rambam, in addition to all of the other writings for which he was very, very famous, also wrote a letter that was sent to communities of people who were very distressed about the fact that they were being shamed by a rabbi who lived in mainland Europe, who was criticizing them, having come from the Iberian Peninsula, for the fact that they converted to Islam on pain of death rather than be executed. And the Rambam comes down very, very forcefully, tearing shreds into the argument of this rabbi who does not know, does not understand, did not stand in our shoes, because the Rambam himself actually fled at this time. He came originally from Spain, and he fled because there was this increasing persecution. People had to convert to Islam or be executed. And he makes it very, very clear that Islam is not idolatry. And that when faced with a choice between conversion and death, one should convert and then leave, get out of there and go somewhere where they can actually practice Judaism. This issue here, just to keep this very, very simple, he's talking about what they consider to be, properly speaking, idolatry, actually bona fide idolatry. And in terms of that, one must die rather than do it. I want to be clear, though, that's not the only thing that he's saying. He's saying two things. He's saying, first of all, that there are three big transgressions that you must die rather than commit. But he's also saying, and this is where it's going to get a little bit controversial, he's also saying that when it comes to everything else, you should transgress rather than die. It's important that we're mindful there's two different statements here. The statement that you should die rather than transgress one of those big three, and the statement that you should transgress anything else in the Torah rather than die. And the reason this is going to get a little bit controversial is because along come a couple of rabbis, and they make a few points about that second point. They say, look, that's not exactly what he meant. there are actually situations in which you should die rather than transgress any mitzvah within the Torah. And this might surprise some of you to encounter the idea that there were ever these sorts of pro-martyrdom traditions within Judaism, but they used to actually be very, very widespread. So I'll read it to you inside just to have a little bit of a look at what the text says. We've got these two different rabbis who both came from Roman Palestine. They moved to Babylonia. Their names were, there's a bunch of rabbis, by the way, who made this move, but there were these two in particular, Rav Dimi and Ravin. And in both of these instances, what the Talmud often tells us is when they came, they shared information about these Palestinian rabbis. Rabbi Yochanan was a Palestinian rabbi. He lived in Tiberias. And so when Rav Dimi came, for example, he pointed out that when Rabbi Yochanan said that you should transgress any mitzvah in the Torah, barring those three, rather than die, he was not speaking of a time of government persecution. But in a time when the government is persecuting Jews, that raises the stakes, as it were. And that even a minor mitzvah, you should die rather than transgress. Okay, this is what Rav Dimi is telling us that Rabbi Yochanan meant. And then along comes Ravin, and he adds another stipulation. He says, yeah, inasmuch as he wasn't talking about a time of government persecution, he's also talking only about private transgressions. But if you've got an audience, if they're putting you on a show, if they've got an arena, for example, and there's people there in the stands and they're watching them, make a Jew eat pork, whatever it may be, then in those circumstances as well, it's better to die than to transgress. That one's death in these situations is considered a Kiddush Hashem. It's a sanctification of the name of God. Again, as I mentioned, it might surprise people to know that there was ever within Judaism this sort of pro-martyrdom tradition. But it's quite widespread. And to give you an example, there's a lot of texts after the Talmud, a lot of midrash after the Talmud that talk about Rabbi Akiva putting words in Rabbi Akiva's mouth. Rabbi Akiva says, according to these texts, his whole life he yearned for the opportunity to die al Kiddush Hashem, to be a martyr. And he rejoices when he's given the opportunity to do that. And as with all of these texts, that reflects the world of those authors. Okay, that reflects the times and the places in which they are living, in which they considered dying al Kiddush Hashem was the greatest thing that a person could do. You can't just choose to do it. Okay, I can't think of an example that's not going to sound sort of flippant, but if a person is in a situation, generally speaking, where the only way to save their life is by violating one of the mitzvot, assuming it's not one of those big three, they have to violate that mitzvah. You have to break Shabbos to save a life. It's a transgression. You can't say, I'm not going to do it, and I will therefore be martyred. That's not considered martyrdom. Okay, the stipulations for what constitute martyrdom within this text, I think, are quite clear. It's a time of governmental persecution, or there's a show. They're putting on a performance. There's a crowd. There's an audience of people in some respect. So it's a public thing, and in those circumstances, you can't do that thing even in order to save your life. I'm going to come to your text in a moment. I haven't forgotten the question that you just asked. I know it sounds like I've skipped past it. But I wanted to mention this, and I don't want to move away from it just so quickly, because it is very, very controversial. And we're talking here about pikuach nefesh, and at the same time, we're kind of encountering this sort of pro-martyrdom tradition. This idea that saving a life takes precedence over everything, barring these certain circumstances in which losing one's life sends an even more powerful message. And there is a long history of this. There is a long history of people losing their lives and sending this very powerful message. And a long history of people doing so under circumstances similar to the ones that we mentioned before, of being forcibly converted to another religion and refusing to do it and losing their lives in the process. So this business of pikuach nefesh is suddenly not so simple. It started off so simple, we didn't even have a source for it. We just wanted to know, well, where do we get this idea from? What can we sort of find something to pin it to? And it's kind of got a little bit muddier. And to address the point that you made a moment ago, it gets a little bit muddier still when one considers these big three the three things that you cannot do even in order to save a life, when it comes to murder, there's a very big exception. And the exception is what they refer to as the din of the rodef, the law of the pursuer. If we're talking about saving a person's life, if the reason that a person's life is in danger is because there is a particular individual who is going to do them harm, you have an obligation to stop that individual and may even use lethal force in order to do so. In fact, if that's the only way you can stop them, you are obligated to use lethal force in order to do so. Self-defense, absolutely. So that's kind of coded into the law. But as you pointed out a moment ago, there are instances in recent history where this has been used and abused. And a classic example, and it's the instance in which I first encountered myself the law of the Radef. I think I was 14 or 15 years old, and people were talking about this because there was this guy in Israel by the name of Yigal Amir who had invoked the law of the Radef in order to justify shooting and killing the Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin. That he argued that Yitzhak Rabin was engaging in actions that were going to lead to widespread death and devastation, so that the Torah actually obligated him to put Rabin down, to kill Rabin, that Rabin fell under the category of a rodef. And you can see, therefore, how these laws can very easily be abused in this fashion. I don't know if you had any thoughts that you wanted to share on that, having mentioned that a moment ago.
I heard it when I first, and I was told, I don't know, that a lot of rabbis, not all, there's many who opposed it, but that the killer found justification among some rabbis, but not others.
He did, absolutely. So there were people who justified that act, and it won't surprise anybody here, I'm sure to know, that when it came to that particular act, that particular political assassination, that just as there were people who decried it and who found it repugnant, there were also communities of people who celebrated it and who supported it. And it was not just then, but in many times in Israeli history, has been quite a massive kind of conflict amongst Jews within Israel as regards what to do for peace. I'm going to come to you in just a moment, but Rabbi?
Simon, I have a couple of questions, and I wonder whether they're of interest to the entire group. As people of conscience, in a world that is filled with turmoil and death and threat and danger, we want to do something. How do we judge where it's appropriate to exercise our humanity and take a role and play a part and assist? And that was one question. How do we decide whose blood is redder than sense and whose danger is more acute? The second one occurred to me in between the time you announced your topic and tonight, and that was the shooting of the school children in Texas. And what was so fascinating about that, I'm sure many would agree, is that the police officers evidently waited for as much as an hour because they feared their lives were in danger. All the while the children were being slaughtered by the murderer. Whether any of that is of interest to you or whether you comment.
I think it's of great interest to me. I'm sure it's of great interest actually to everybody, and I don't think that there are easy sort of answers to this. But I do think it's interesting that you used that expression when you said to judge whose blood is redder, because as people may or may not be aware, this is an expression that is found within the Talmud, that it's used as the logical justification for a person's not needing to risk their own life in order to save somebody else. So notwithstanding the fact that police officers have an added sort of institutional responsibility, or I should say an occupational responsibility, like a soldier, for example, that in particular lines of work that a person may have beyond the sort of responsibility that a regular civilian has, an additional level of occupational responsibility. Notwithstanding that consideration, when the Talmud discusses the fact, and they do treat it as a fact, again, it's one of those things that they don't They don't question, they treat it as a fact that you as a private citizen are not obligated to risk your life to save another person. They use that phrase. They say, who's to say that their blood is redder? Perhaps your blood is redder. Which is to say, if it's a situation in which you're going to lose your life to save them, maybe it should just be them losing their lives to save you. But we don't trade lives. Okay, you're not under no obligation to lose your life to save another person. You can do it. You're allowed to do it. And people do it, particularly when the person who is in danger is someone very dear to them. Okay, so if somebody's child is in danger, parents will often put themselves into physical danger to try to protect their child. But it is important to be mindful that they don't have a legal obligation to do that, halachically speaking, notwithstanding their obligations as a parent to a child. Let's put that to the side. When it comes to a perfect stranger, they don't have a legal obligation to risk their life to save the life of a stranger. As Rabbi Gary mentioned, I have the great privilege of working in the Melbourne Holocaust Museum. One of the things that we deal with a great deal is the fact that there were some remarkable individuals who did just that, who risked their lives to try to save the lives of perfect strangers. We'll never know how many people did so, because sadly, many of them did not succeed. Many of them lost their lives, and those people that they were trying to save lost their lives as well. But it's a phenomenal thing. It's an amazing thing, and perhaps a difficult thing to truly identify with, to understand how a person might do that. It's a beautiful thing. But there's no legal obligation to do it. Police officers is a different story. When a person has a job that comes with a certain degree of training and a certain degree of commitment, equipment, and suiting and so forth, and there's an expectation of them, I think it's disappointing when they don't exercise that, right? But I do think it's interesting you use that phrase, that, whose blood is redder. Yeah.
So, in the case of Israel and Ukraine, people in Ukraine are in danger, but Israel needs Russia and Syria. So do, as is Jewish people in Israel, do we help the people in Ukraine with weapons, but we will risk Russia in stopping our attacks on Hezbollah and things like that? How do you analyse that situation?
On this, I have no comment. I can't say. It's an ugly game. I don't know. I'm not in any position to comment on political issues and how those sorts of decisions get made, and it's very messy. And in some ways, we have had the luxury for a significant period of time of not having to deal with those sorts of questions, of not having the responsibilities that come with statehood. And that has allowed some of these sorts of considerations to remain hypothetical and to remain within the realm of fantasy. What should one do? And now that the Jews in Israel are burdened with the responsibility now of statehood, that carries a whole host of other questions, and it is thoroughly beyond any level of expertise that I would pretend to have. I honestly couldn't say. Which is not to say that it's not a good question. I think it's a fine question, and a good one to ask.
It is going to save the life of the cousins.
Mm-hmm.
So frequently they set up locally for anyone who's injured in their home.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Of course.
So they're actually playing both sides. They're saving their lives, but they're also saving the lives of the people around.
And that, I think, comes also to the point that Rabbi Gary was making as well, but it's on a different side of things, which is that sort of that occupational responsibility that a person might have. So ambulance workers, for example, are not in a position to discriminate between different patients. They can't say, we're going to pick up these people, we're not going to pick up that individual over there, but they'll deal with all of the people in a mass casualty event, even if one of those individuals was the one responsible for the event. Yeah.
So recently, I'm not sure, there was a demonstration, there was extreme Orthodox people marching and saying things like death to the Palestinians, death to the Arabs,
I don't know. Manishtana.
but I'm curious, in that situation, wouldn't that go against this, where they're
Okay. Well, that's it's good to sort of open a can of worms when I got 5 minutes left to go. That's a very, very good question, and it's a side of things that I have not actually addressed at all. But it is worth acknowledging, even though I can't do it justice. But it is, I think, worth acknowledging that in the earliest texts that deal with this issue, or let me qualify that, not the very earliest, because the biblical texts themselves are a little bit oblique. They'll use phrases like re'echa, your fellow, for example, sometimes translated as your neighbor, and it's not really clear exactly who they mean, but there are definitely some passages within the Bible where stipulations are quite clearly relating to other Israelites or to the stranger who dwells among you. In the rabbinic literature, they understand those to be references to Jews. So I'll give you an example, and it's not a nice example, so I'm being a little bit sneaky by giving you a not very nice example very shortly before we finish up, but it's in Tractate Yoma, and it's in the Mishnah, and it talks about a wall has fallen on somebody, and it's Yom Kippur. And normally on Yom Kippur, won't go into the specific reasons why. Yom Kippur is like a Shabbos, basically. It is a Shabbos. You can't sort of go through the rocks in the wall in order to sort of, separate them. Let's say there's I don't know, a precious object in there that you want to retrieve. But there's a person in there. Okay, so what the Mishnah is saying is you must do it to save the person's life. But if you look closely at the language that the Mishnah is using, it's a little bit controversial. It says you should do this even if you don't know whether or not the person is there, even if you don't know whether or not the person is still alive, even if you don't know whether or not the person is Jewish. The implication would therefore seem to be that just as if you know with certainty that they're not there, you don't do it. And just as if you know with certainty that they're not alive, you don't do it. So too, if you know with certainty that they're not Jewish, you don't do it. That would seem to be the implication. And it's very, very important, and I want to really underline this, it's very, very important that we appreciate, as I've mentioned a number of times already, that all of these texts are produced by people who are the product of the time and the places in which they lived. And that you can't understand these texts without recourse to those general socio-cultural situations, that when the Mishnah says something, that's not the law, that's just the Mishnah saying something. The process by which that becomes law is a very, very long process. And today, there is absolutely no distinction made between whether or not a person is Jewish or not Jewish. And I would argue that's been the case since at least the 14th century. Okay, and one of the people who sort of commented very vociferously on this is a scholar by the name of Menachem Meiri, who argued that these rabbinic laws concerning the non-Jew do not apply to non-Jews today. Because he also, in the 14th century, recognised, as everybody does, I think, that these texts are the products of the time and the places in which they lived. The Torah is Torah, and the ideas contained within the Mishnah are sacred in as much as they are part of this process of Torah Sheba'al Peh, okay, of this oral Torah. But the specific examples that are given, they're examples drawn from their world. And in their world, when we look at how they speak about non-Jews within texts like the Mishnah, they're talking about practitioners of idolatry. They're talking about, in Palestinian texts, they're talking about Greeks and Romans, and there's a kind of a history here of persecution. They're not talking about, say, Christians. They're not talking about, or even, didn't even mean to make this necessarily specific to any one particular group. Even within our society today, when it comes to people who do not profess a religion, who might see themselves as atheists, might see themselves as entirely secular, they do not apply to these people either. But it's an important thing to bear in mind, in any case, that these earliest texts do make that differentiation. And so when you ask whether or not people today might be not sort of following the spirit of the law, I think those people today would understand a different development of that law, that they are still being mindful of all of those same texts, but they're understanding them differently. They're working through them differently to how you might be understanding them. That's a very kind of vague answer, and I am very mindful of the time, and I don't want to end really on that note. So let me just sort of pull a bow around this, so to speak. Just to say that my intention this evening was to give you really a little bit of an introduction to the idea that even a seemingly simple concept like pikuach nefesh is fraught with various complications. That at the end of the day, really nothing is simple and nothing is obvious. That even this sort of basic principle that saving a life takes precedence over everything is itself, whatever the outcomes of that conversation may be, is itself something that has historically been subject to discussion. But to come back to a question that was asked a moment ago, this relates very, very much to a whole host of different issues that exist today. And in response to Rabbi Gary's question, I would argue that what a lot of these texts would suggest, in my opinion, is twofold. Is that on the one hand, these things begin at home, that it begins very much in the local community, that we have a very clear responsibility to protect the needy who are in our midst, and to further equality of life of people within our country. But beyond that, I don't think that there is anything that does not satisfy the preconditions of pikuach nefesh, and that where there is a clear necessity, where there is a clear need for these things, I think that we do, at the very least, have an obligation not to do nothing. And I'll end on that particular point. Thank you.
Very nicely brought together at the end, and we're so appreciative. Simon, on behalf of our community, your many new friends here, and your students, it's our pleasure to present you with this very, very lovely gift. We'll leave it here until such time as you're able to retrieve it. I'll keep it in my office, and when you come next to the synagogue. Thank you very, very much. And I have the great pleasure to announce that Simon, who has been teaching a fascinating multi-session course on Rabbi Oshri, will be continuing with us throughout the rest of the year. And Simon, what are you going to be teaching? What did you decide?
What I would like to be doing, and is a little bit later this year, teaching a course on the Mishnah. We'll look at tractate Rosh Hashanah. Those who participate in this course, my intention is we will actually finish that tractate together, and subsequent to that, I would love to run a course on the Gemara, which is the Talmud. Obviously not with the intention of finishing a tractate, but with the intention of looking at some passages within the Talmud that I think are sort of indicative of the style of the text, and getting a little bit of a sense of the flavour, and again, as with what we've looked at this evening, not shying away from some of the grittier passages within it.
Thank you. It's a very important thing that Simon's doing, helping us and our Committee on Lifelong Jewish Learning to really expand our knowledge and broaden our reach in terms of our Jewish texts. So, kol hakavod, and thank you very much. Friends, this is the update. You've all been good sports. Of course, you've been well fed. I'd like to encourage you now to be really brave, get out of your seats, and come forward, some beneath the chuppah with me and with Tammy. Very intimate little space. Or up on the bima, we're going to do a kind of experiential activity on the Aseret HaDibrot, the 10 Commandments, that will be read aloud from the bima tomorrow at our service. Patrick's been kind enough to volunteer to lower the lights, and it's going to be very, very beautiful. And afterwards, we'll go next door, and I will announce the winner of the cheesecake competition. And you can that is to say, you can eat a little bit more cheesecake if you still have a taste for it. So please come forward, and thank you so much again, Simon.
Thank you very much.
Oh, that's a pleasure, mate. Okay, let's do it. Oh, well, we need a chumash. We need 2 chumashim. Okay, but you can use that.
Oh, lovely.
The short one? No, I think the longer one would be better. might ask, do we assemble here on the bima beneath a chuppah? All right, who's gonna be the lucky couple tonight? So the notion is that the chosana, the wedding is between God and Israel. And whether you prefer to think of God as the bride or Israel as the groom, whatever you prefer, the notion is that just as the ring is a symbol of the binding love and responsibilities that a couple has one for the other, the Torah is the symbol of God's love and Israel's love for one another. And so as Shavuot is known as Matan Torah, it's the time of the giving of the Torah. I'm going to give out 10 little readings, one each for each of the Aseret HaDibrot. You have a nice loud voice, you know. Okay, let's see. All right, I've got a couple more here. This only takes a moment. And it's quite painless, I assure you. Does this have the troop? Oh, it does, doesn't it? Okay. So as we begin to place ourselves at Sinai, we must try and bring to mind the scene that obtained there. A people that had only recently made its way out of Mitzrayim, crossed the Yam Suf, pursued through the sea, only to reach the base of the mountain. There they stood, Tachat Hahar. The mountain, it's said, is trembling. The people, too, are trembling. There's smoke, there's fire, and the Midrash goes on to say, utter and complete stillness. Not a cow mooed, not a bird tweeted. And then there was this word. Anochi Adonai Elohecha Asher Hotzeticha Me'eretz Mitzrayim Mibeit Avadim.
I am the eternal your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, the house of bondage.
And could I ask whoever has been given the first to please read?
The object of the whole Torah is that one should become the Torah oneself.
Lo yihiyeh lecha Elohim acherim al panai Lo ta'aseh lecha Fesel v'chol tumuna asher b'shamayim mimal v'asher be'eretz mitachat v'asher b'mayim mitachat la'aretz.
You shall have no other gods beside me. You shall not make for yourself a sculpted image, or any likeness of what is in the heavens above, or on the earth below, or in the waters under the sea. You shall not bow down to them or serve them.
Number 2, please.
It was life under the yoke of the law which implanted freedom and peace in the heart of the Jew. so that hatred and vengeance could not lodge there.
Lo tishtachave lahem v'lo tavdedeim ki anochi Adonai Elohecha Elkanah poked avon avot al banim al shleishim bal ribeim lesonai v'yoseh chesed le'alafim le'avai u'leshomrei mitzvotai.
You shall not bow down to them or serve them, for I, the Eternal, your God, am an impassioned God, visiting the guilt of the fathers upon the children, upon the third and upon the fourth generations to those who reject me, but showing kindness to the 1,000th generation of those who love me and keep my commandments.
Torah is a city's rampart, and students are its towers.
Lo tisa et shem Adonai Elohecha lashav ki lo yinakeh Adonai et asher yisad shemo lashav.
You shall not swear falsely by the name of the Eternal your God, for the Eternal will not clear one who swears falsely by God's name.
If not for Torah, Israel would not at all differ from the nations of the world.
Zachor et Yom HaShabbat lekadesho.
Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy.
The altar will be abide as long as the temple, the light of the Torah will abide forever.
Shehi shed yamim tavod v'asitacho melaktecha v'yom hashavi Shabbat l'Adonai Elohecha lo ta'asecho melacha ata uvincha uvitecha avdecha v'yamatecha uvehemetecha v'gercha asher bisharecha ki sheshet yamim asa Adonai et hashamayim ve'et haaretz ve'et hayam ve'et kol asher bam vayanach bayom hashvi'i al kein beirach Adonai et yom hashabbat vayekadeshehu.
6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the 7th day is a Sabbath for the Eternal your God. You shall not do any work, you, your son or daughter, your male, female slave, or your cattle, or the stranger who is within your settlements. For in 6 days the Eternal made heaven and earth and sea, and all that is in them. And God rested on the 7th day. Therefore the Eternal blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it.
All souls stood at Sinai, each accepting its share in Torah.
Kabed et avicha ve'et imecha lema'an ya'arichun yamecha al hadama asher Adonai Elohecha noten lalach.
Honor your father and your mother, that you may long endure on the land which the Eternal your God is giving you.
Number 7.
Scripture likens the Torah to the desert, to fire and to water, like these three, is for each one.
Lo tirtzach.
You shall not murder.
Number 8.
Torah was not given to angels.
Lo, that's for sure. Lo tinaf.
You shall not commit adultery.
Turn it again and again, for everything is in it. Contemplate it, grow grey and old over it, and swerve not from it. for there is no greater good.
Lo tignov.
You shall not steal.
Each fresh discovery by a Torah student compared to new heaven.
Lo ta'anev re'acha eid shaker. Lo tachamod beit re'acha. Lo tachamod eished re'acha. Ve'avdo ve'amato ve'shoro ve'chamoro. Ve'chol asher l're'acha.
You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or his male or female slave, or his ox, or his donkey, or anything that is your neighbor's.
Is there one more?
I had 10.
Okay. All the people witnessed the thunder and the lightning, the blare of the horn and the mountain smoking. And when the people saw it, they fell back and stood at a distance, saying, "You speak to us, and we will obey, but not let God speak to us, lest we die." It then goes on to say, to end more happily, Na'aseh, we will do. So may it be for us. May the Aseret HaDibrot, these 10 utterances, be not only heard tonight, but may they find their way into our hearts and to our hands, that we, like the children of Israel historically, might be a bracha, a blessing and an or, a light to our nation and to the peoples of the world. Amen v'amen. Amen. All right, good yontif, everyone. So let's all move now, I think, into the hall for this big announcement. So exciting. And we'll finish up with some cheesecake.
Yeah, there's a little bit more cheesecake. Finish them off. And
Please be reminded the service tomorrow starts promptly at 10 o'clock. It's going to be a beautiful morning, a big day. We're going to read the book of Ruth. We're going to observe Yizkor. We're going to sing Hallel. We're going to read Torah. And we're going to honor the Ryans. Yeah, well, we're up on a podium.